Welcome everyone to Aging Insight. I'm Lisa Scholmeyer. I'm here with John Ross. John and I are elder law attorneys here in our area, and we specialize in the needs and legal issues that relate to seniors and people with disabilities. And you know, we hope that you really get something out of every Aging Insight, and our purpose is to bring information right to you. And so, John, today particularly, I think our topic is perfect for people who are blessed to be grandparents.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's summertime. The kids are out of school, and I know when I was a kid, my grandparents had a house on Lake Granbury outside of Fort Worth, and every summer for 2 or 3 weeks, my parents got the luxury of getting rid of their rambunctious little redheaded child by sending him up to hang out with Meemaw and Pawpaw for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, you thought you were the one that was taking the trip, right?
I was going to the lake. I was going to get to go water skiing. It was going to be awesome. But yeah, I think my parents were getting that. Now, as a parent, I see where they were going with that deal.
Yeah. So today on Aging Insight, we want to talk about some of the issues that come up with grandparents when grandparents are caring for their grandchildren, whether that's on a summertime vacation basis, John, like you talked about, spending 2 or 3 weeks with grandma, or even if you provide a lot more care, after school care and weekend care for some grandchildren. Today we're going to talk about some of the legal issues you might run into while you're doing that.
Yeah, well, Lisa, to going back and talking about going up there for those summers, as a little redheaded kid, the one thing the first touch of sun does to me every year is turn my skin into a nice tomatoey color.
Blister, yes.
Yeah. So I would almost always manage to get sunburned
straight up.
And one year, it was bad, really bad, actual blisters, and that involved a trip to the hospital.
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, here's my grandparents who are having to carry little John up to the hospital to get some medical treatment because I'm in pretty bad shape. I got some pretty deep burns going on, and you get to the hospital and as a child, I cannot consent to my own medical treatment. I was probably 6 or 8 or something. So I can't sign the admission forms and consent to treatment and things like that. But the thing is, neither could my grandparents. They're not my parents. They have no legal right to consent to medical treatment on my behalf. And so here we are at the hospital, and we've got problems because I need treatment, and the hospital's not really all that interested in treating me because of a lack of ability for anybody to consent. So, I think a lot of times when people are thinking about the grandkids coming, they're thinking about the flowers and sunshine part of it.
Right.
Everything's going to go right. Yeah. Unfortunately, in our practice, we plan for when things go wrong.
True, and it's real common with grandchildren to get into an accident while at a grandparent's house that needs a few stitches, or otherwise come down with an infection, or that needs some medical treatment. And if the parents are off on vacation, maybe they're on a cruise, they're even out of the country, that puts everybody into a pickle. Where the hospital, they have their rules and regulations about who can consent to treatment for a minor child, and the grandparents are just hoping to get, they want to take care of the problem and get their grandchild seen by a medical person, and of course the kid, they want to be treated. It can become a real issue, so it's always best to be prepared for these situations.
That's right. Now, most people, when they think about this sort of stuff, they think about it in the context of an emergency. And in an emergency situation, there are some provisions in the laws that give a priority list of people who can consent to medical treatment on behalf of a minor. And you can generally expect that it's going to start with the nearest kinship and go from there. So parents of the minor child, if the parents are not available, an adult brother and sister. If they're not available, then some grandparents. And so in an emergency context, there are provisions already in place. Unfortunately, what you consider an emergency and what a hospital considers to be an emergency are probably two different things. When you start talking about emergencies in the hospital context, it usually means treatment that's going to prevent the immediate loss of life. So sure, they can do surgery to repair a heart that's stopped or things like that. But, like in my case where I have a relatively severe burn, but the burn in and of itself is not necessarily a life-threatening injury. It's painful, it needs treatment, but it's not necessarily an emergency as that term is used. And so you can't just rely on, I get this a lot of times from clients. They say, people say, well, surely if I go into the hospital and it's an emergency, then they're going to treat them. That's true if it's a real emergency.
Right. And frankly, thankfully, most of the situations we encounter with grandchildren visiting grandparents are not of that emergency nature.
That's right.
As defined by the hospital. Bites, cuts, ear infections, those things, not emergencies.
That's right. And so you're still going to need some medical treatment. So you got to know what you need in those circumstances.
Right. And so, John, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about some papers that parents can sign for a grandparent on a temporary basis to give those grandparents rights to seek that medical treatment if the need arises while that grandchild is in the care of a grandparent. So we'll take our break and we'll come back and get into the details of this.
Welcome back to Aging Insight, everybody. I'm John Ross here with Lisa Scholmeyer, and you're watching Aging Insight, which is the program where we bring our knowledge of the legal stuff related to retirement and being older and navigating through all of those years to you, so that you don't have any problems out there as you try to make your way. And in light of it being summer and the kids are off on summer vacation.
That's right.
And they might be coming to stay with you. Well, here's what you need to know.
Right. So, we were talking before the break about the idea that, if grandchildren are staying with you, maybe their parents are off on vacation, and these grandchildren are with you for a week or two, that there might be a situation that comes up where you need to get health care treatment for those grandchildren. And during our first segment, we talked about how as a grandparent, you have absolutely no right to consent to medical treatment for your grandchild. And, John, I think this is something that a lot of grandparents don't realize.
Right. You don't really think about it necessarily. You're like, yeah, I'm the grandparent. I got the kids here.
Right.
I should be able to do whatever.
And so basically the state of our law is that grandparents actually have almost no rights of any kind when it comes to a grandchild.
Yeah, this all relates back to a Supreme Court case.
The Trotter case, yes.
Yeah, decades ago. But basically that Trotter case by the Supreme Court said that parents' rights are essentially absolute.
Correct.
And so they just don't extend beyond to the grandparents. And so there's just no rights there. So because of that, there's some things you need. And we think about this in our own context all the time. If I became incapacitated and I was at the hospital and I cannot communicate my wishes to the hospital staff, I know that I need to appoint somebody to handle that sort of thing. And this is the same concept.
Right, but we just don't think about it with grandchildren. So when it comes to making medical decisions and giving consents, regarding medical treatment for grandchildren, you as a grandparent, you have no legal right to make such decisions. Therefore, you need to make sure that the parent has provided you with the written consents for you to make medical decisions on behalf of that minor grandchild while the parent is not available. And in order to, number one, John, this is something that's going to need to be in writing.
Absolutely.
Because obviously a hospital personnel, I mean, if you could just say, I'm the grandparent, and the parent said it was okay, then, they're just not going to buy that. So this is something that has to be in writing. And this is something that we usually call it, a temporary healthcare power of attorney regarding a minor.
That's right. And so, this is the parent signing something that says, here are the people that I authorize to consent to medical treatment on behalf of my child. Now, Lisa noted that it was a temporary, and that's because typically with this sort of thing, you're going to limit the duration in the document. Now, if I'm doing a medical power of attorney for myself, well, I don't have any idea when I might need that. But if I'm appointing Lisa, for example, well, I don't ever want that thing to expire, because I might get sick tomorrow or I might get sick in 10 years, but whenever it is, I need that person to be able to step in and make medical decisions. On the other hand, if I'm leaving my kids with Granny and Granddad for 2 weeks, it may only make sense for me to say, well, here's a medical authorization, but it's temporary. It lasts from, July of this date to August of this date. And so it's limited to that particular period of time. Now, you don't have to make it limited in that way. Lisa, I think of in context of, maybe the people where Granny and Granddad live across the street.
Sure, or Granny and Granddad are there and they're the pickup for every day after school.
Yeah, they're involved with the children every single day of the week. Unlike when I was a kid, I saw my grandparents for the 2 weeks in the summer and at Thanksgiving and at Christmas.
Right.
And maybe on my birthday.
Yeah.
But other than that, 3-4 times a year. And so it would only make sense in those cases maybe to just have it in those limited circumstances while I was there, particularly while I was there without my parents.
Right. And these days we do have a lot of parents. I mean, just in the past few weeks, I visited with a number of families where the parents are actually going out of the country, or they're going to be on a cruise ship, and they are just absolutely going to be unreachable.
That's right.
In the case of an emergency. So leaving the children with the grandparents, they definitely want to have that writing that gives consent to the grandparents to take the child for treatment. And in this case, I believe all the folks I've spoken with, they're going to put the dates that they're going to be out and that the grandchildren are be with the grandparents as part of their consent.
And within this same document, you can also limit. So for example, and I'm not saying that parents and their kids don't always see eye to eye, but it has happened in the past.
Sure.
I'm sure. But there could be, for example, if you're that parent that's planning on leaving the kids with your own parents, leaving your kids with their grandparents, maybe you do have a difference of opinion on certain medical procedures.
Right. We've seen this come up before with certain procedures such as immunizations. There are certain parents who have foregone immunizations or maybe delayed immunizations. And here on Aging Insight, we're certainly not going to try to visit the science or the strategy of doing that. But if a parent and a grandparent have different attitudes about something like that, a parent can actually limit that medical power of attorney so that the grandparent cannot go and obtain a bunch of immunizations for that grandchild while that grandchild is in their grandparents' care. And so that's one particular area we've seen. Other areas that we've noted have been, reproductive health care, such as birth control or something like that, mental or psychological care. that we've seen parents who wish to limit a grandparent's right to seek that type of treatment for a grandchild. Most parents are thinking, John, about this in the terms of a sudden illness or an accident that has come up, and that they want their child to be able to receive treatment.
Right. So you can limit it if there's a reason, or if you feel like there's something that maybe you don't want in there. Now, in addition to being able to make medical treatment decisions, a grandparent may also need access to medical records. So, for example, if little John, who's had this bad sunburn, and now I'm at the hospital, and so okay, so yeah, my grandparents have a medical treatment consent form. They've presented that to the hospital. The hospital is now treating me for my burns, and the hospital say, well, grandparent, does John have any allergies?
Sure, or when was your last tetanus shot?
Or when was your last tetanus shot, or something like that.
Yeah.
And my grandparents may not know that, but they could call my family practice doctor back home. The problem is, if you call to get a copy of somebody else's medical records, you're going to run into a fun little law called the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act.
So yes, HIPAA rears its head again. So, let's take a break, and we'll come back and talk about HIPAA, and also we'll talk about some things for those grandparents that are day in, day out with their grandchildren, maybe some school records and things like that. So stick with us. Welcome back to Aging Insight. I'm Lisa Scholmeyer here with John Ross, and today we're talking about a really fun topic, John, and that is having the grandchildren come and visit with the grandparents. We've talked about it a lot today in the context of having the grandchildren come for an extended visit, which is always a great time for everybody. But we were talking about that the grandparents need to have a written consent form that the parent is authorizing the grandparent to seek and obtain medical treatment for a grandchild if the need arises. And right before the break, you brought up something that even if people have thought about the need for a consent form,
that's right,
they may not think about the need that grandparent may need access to the health history and information of that child.
That's right. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it,
Yes.
Our medical information is protected by a law called the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which most people know as HIPAA. HIPAA says that nobody can look at another person's medical information without their signed written permission. And when I say nobody, I mean nobody, not a spouse, not a parent of an adult, not anybody. And so in our situation that we're describing here, where this minor child has had an accident and maybe the grandparent needs to obtain some information related to past medical care, or get a copy, or call their home doctor and find out when they got their last tetanus shot, all of that is protected medical information which cannot be provided under the HIPAA law to an unauthorized source. So in addition to this medical treatment consent form, we also need a HIPAA release signed by those parents on behalf of that minor child that say, here's who, maybe like the grandparents or maybe even other people in addition to the grandparents, here's a list of people that under HIPAA have access to the child's medical information. Medical power of attorney or medical treatment consent forms and HIPAA releases go hand in hand. You really shouldn't have one without the other in any circumstance, because you just can't do much making medical decisions for somebody if you don't have access to the information.
Right, and besides those accidents and illnesses that can pop up during that summer visit with grandma, kids aren't the most responsible, so kids can lose that inhaler they need for asthma. Maybe they didn't bring their EpiPen for severe allergies, and maybe that grandparent needs to obtain those medications while the parent is gone on vacation or out of touch. And so this consent form and these HIPAA releases are going to be absolutely necessary in order to do that.
Yeah, yeah, and again, these things can be limited by time. So it doesn't have to be a blanket release forever and ever. It can be limited to that period where the child's going to be with the grandparents.
Right. And the other point to make, John, is these days, sometimes your grandchildren are coming to visit. Maybe their parents are divorced. And so long as a parent who has the right to make medical decisions for that child, it doesn't have to be both parents signing on that form, so long as one parent who has those medical decision rights signs that form in favor of the grandparents.
That's right. And this is just good. This is good advice. Now, as we reach the end of the show, there's kind of one other situation, and this is the really bad one that certainly hope never happens. But there's always the possibility that you've got the grandkids and you're waiting for the parents to come back home. And they don't.
John, these days, just like my clients that are traveling, they're traveling to Europe and overseas, and it's a pretty bad world out there. And so they're worried about, they don't expect anything bad to happen, but they are planning in case it does. So if a parent doesn't return because they themselves die in an accident or some sort of event, well, now what?
Right, because one thing a lot of people don't realize is, for example, if I've given my parents the authorization to make medical decisions for my child, that document is only valid as long as I, as the parent, remain competent and alive.
Sure.
But if I die or have such a catastrophic injury that I've lost my abilities altogether, that has also essentially revoked that same document.
Right.
In which case, we're going to have some more issues here.
Yeah. So the other thing a parent ought to consider is they ought to consider signing a form called a designation of guardian for minor children if the need arises. And this designation of guardian is a form that the parent signs that says, hey, if I'm deceased or I'm in a catastrophic accident and I'm in a coma and I cannot care for my children, this form is the parent speaking and saying, I want grandparents to be the guardian of my children, in that event. And so this document, there's no automatic designation just because you're a grandparent. Once again, we get back to the point that a grandparent has no rights, no priority. And so once again, a parent should designate, if they wish, that grandparent to be the guardian of their minor children if that catastrophe ever happens.
Right. It'll still probably involve a court process to get an actual guardianship of the minor child in place. But having that designation of guardian is essentially going to make that process as smooth and easy as it can be, because
Sure.
it tells the judge in advance who the parents trusted.
Sure.
And so anybody with a minor child should have a designation of guardian in place for those minor children. And even if it's not you, if you're going to be in charge of those kids while the parents are off doing their thing, you ought to at least know who those designated guardians are in the event of that catastrophe, so that you can reach out to them and they can begin the guardianship process, because child's needs don't stop just because something bad happened to the parent.
Sure. And the other thing is, at designation of guardian form, it can be changed at any time. So maybe while your children are younger and the grandparents are younger, that's that's who you want designated. But maybe as the children get older and the grandparents get older and maybe have their own health challenges, maybe you want to change that designation of guardian to someone else.
That's right. Well, once again, you've hung out with us for a solid half hour and hopefully learned a few things. If you want more, you can always check out our Aging Insight radio show on 98.7 FM every Saturday at noon. You can pick up a copy of our Aging Insight magazine, available at your doctor's office or even by swinging by our office over at Ross and Schollmeyer. You can even check out our website, aginginsight.com, or you could just stick around until next week for another episode. See you then.
Bye-bye.